Day in our country did not come out of nowhere. To many of us, it was not only expected, but inevitable. A year ago in Virginia, the largest gun rights rally in the U.S. was held. A section of all political movements were in attendance. Not only right-wing activists, but also BLM organizations, John Brown Gun Club, and anarchist groups. A man was interviewed and he said something that stuck with me. He said that the people you see before you today are all rational people. We will talk to you, we will compromise, we will be peaceful. However, if the country continues down the path it is on, you will only have irrational people, and we do not want that. The sentiment was ignored, pushed aside, laughed at, and marginalized. Months later, the horrific murders of Breonna Taylor and Duncan Lemp by the hands of police occurred within days of each other. Among panic and fear of a global virus, tensions boiled over. An entire summer of riots, police brutality, and tyranny followed. Shortly after, I was interviewed in this very spot, and I echoed the sentiments of that man. It does not matter how you feel about these groups. BLM, Antifa, Boogaloo, 3%ers, right-wing militias, they are not the irrational ones. If the government continues to be illegitimate and tyrannical and uncaring, this summer will be nothing compared to what is to come. Christmas Day, a man drove an RV into downtown Nashville and detonated a car bomb. Weeks later, angry Americans stormed our nation's capital. Now, as every state does in its death throes, the government lashes out further. 30,000 National Guard are deployed to D.C. Weapons of war roll down our streets. Social media megacorporations launched a purge of all left, right, and libertarian voices who oppose the political establishment of both parties. This may be the last chance I get to warn the government of the United States.
Before going any further, I'd like to make one thing perfectly clear. In this video, you will hear reference to a group of white people referred to simply as white people. But know this, I am fully aware not all white people fall into the same category as the white people that will be discussed in this video. But the white people I will be discussing in this video are not only racist, they also claim their white skin should afford them opportunities in life that others should not be afforded, particularly in the United States. If you're not one of these white people, please relax, because you know as well as I do, these types of "you will not replace us" white people are in abundance in the United States. That said, let's get into it. When it comes to the struggle against the oligarchy in the United States, it is not uncommon to hear common class white people say to African Americans, "We're all in this together." The idea of whites and blacks getting together as a cohesive movement to fight against the oligarchy establishment seems like a no-brainer, right? However, there is a problem. Throughout the history of this country as black people, blacks have often fought side by side with other downtrodden groups or groups of people who felt that they were being treated or devalued in some way by the federal government. Even before the state of Israel was founded, I believe that was in 1948, there were Jews in the United States, and they were treated horribly. In fact, the European Jews were treated horribly no matter where they went. They were treated horribly in Russia. We know what happened in Germany. And like I said, they were here in the United States long before, the war with Germany, long before they founded Israel, and they were always treated very badly. And they lived among black people. An article from the Cleveland Restoration Society states the following: nationally, the relationship between Jews and blacks is complex, nuanced, and richly textured. Throughout the years, both groups have been able to find similarities in their history and to empathize with each other. When it comes to housing, both African Americans and Jews have faced discrimination and restrictions, and have consequently found themselves sharing neighborhoods. The Great Migration of African Americans and the second wave of Jewish Eastern European immigration partially overlapped, resulting in large numbers of these two groups locating in prescribed areas of Northern American cities such as Chicago, Philadelphia, and Cleveland. Israel, as we all know, is a place that's supposed to be for all Jews. In fact, they are adamant in stating that no matter who you are, if you're Jewish, and you practice the Jewish religion, you actually have a right to live in the state of Israel. Fast forward to today, and it's not uncommon to see such headlines as Ethiopian Jews denied migration into Israel, plight of Ethiopian Jews in Israel. They didn't want Ethiopian Jews in Israel either, and I could just go on and on and on and on and on. Now, to be perfectly clear, this isn't to pick on European Jews, because black people have an even longer history of fighting against suppression right alongside whites from Europe and Britain. One of the most famous events and very, very pivotal event was Bacon's Rebellion that took place in 1675. But before we get too deep into that, I think we really should try to understand what was the state of mind and the economic state of the average common class white person before coming to the Americas. One of the catalysts for the white slave trade was the fear that England was in danger of being overwhelmed by the poor and the lawless, a perception of insecurity still all too recognizable today. In the course of a few generations, the population had risen by a third. In 1509, Henry VIII came to the throne to inherit a kingdom of around 3 million souls. By the time his daughter Elizabeth faced the Spanish Armada 80 years later, she ruled over a population nearer to 4 million. For landowners fattened by church lands acquired during the Reformation and common lands grabbed through the First Enclosure Acts, it was a time of gallivanting Renaissance luxury. But at the other end of the scale, life in the mid-16th century was pitted and disfigured by poverty. Recurring harvest disasters, the enclosures and economic depressions had left hordes of peasants and laborers dispossessed and on the margins of survival. Once, the monasteries would have offered some succor, but Henry had closed them down, and now the poor roamed the countryside and cluttered the towns. In 1570, 2,000 beggars were reported in Coventry alone. A crowd of 20,000 poor people gathered at the funeral of one rich magnate begging for alms. In London, between 1560 and 1601, there was an 8-fold increase in the number of vagrants ending up in the old Bridgewell Palace, which had become a house of corrections. Inevitably, lawlessness increased. A statute of 1572 begins with the lament, "All parts of this realm of England and Wales be presently with rogues, vagabonds, and sturdy beggars exceedingly pestered, by means whereof daily happeneth in the same realm horrible murders, thefts, and other great outrage, to the high displeasure of Almighty God, and to the great annoyance of the common weal." After 1615, when the door was open for convict transportation, English eyes turned to street children and the possibility of getting rid of them, especially from overcrowded, plague-ridden, crime-ridden, booming London. Street children were not, of course, unique to London in the 16th and 17th centuries. Venetians bewailed the enormous increase in the number of child rogues and beggars who wander around the squares of San Marco and the Rialto, while the Swedes were so concerned about child thieves that several hundred were interned in Stockholm during Queen Christina's coronation. Frenchmen complained in Lyons about the noise of the great number of children crying and hooting with hunger day and night throughout the town. They were making a marvelous racket in the churches. Londoners would have heard the same sounds and seen similar scenes and on a larger scale. The city was teeming with homeless urchins and teenage runaways. A petition asking for action over them referred to the great number of vagrant boys and girls who lie in the streets, having no place of abode nor friends to relieve them. There is no knowing exactly how many street children there were, but in a city of 200,000, they must have totaled many, many thousands. Most of them would have survived hand to mouth through petty theft, begging and selling their bodies. In 1617, Counselors from 100 parishes were called to a meeting in St. Paul's to discuss street children. There might have been a sense of urgency because the Privy Council had recently berated metropolitan officials over the infinite multitude of rogues and vagrants at large in the Liberties. The council had warned that the king was thinking of appointing a man of his own, a provost marshal, to deal with the problem. The St. Paul's meeting agreed to assess each parish with the aim of ridding the city of as many children as possible. Eyes turned to Virginia as the solution. At this point, I'd like to clearly state, this video, of course, is not intended to imply whites had it as bad as African slaves. Most respectable scholars agree African slavery in the Americas was the most horrific form of slavery in the entire known history of slavery. Before planters acquired the legal right to own African slaves, there were black indentured servants. But even they, for example, were punished much more harshly than their white counterparts. During the time the colonies had both African-owned slaves and indentured servants, the system was intentionally set up to create animosity between owned slaves and contracted servants. This was for obvious reasons. Often, situations would arise when both servant and slave would receive punishment for various infractions, like running away together. When caught, it was very common for the black servant or slave to be savagely punished, while their white partner in crime would experience the soft touch of the law. On this subject, Howard Zinn quotes the following in his book, A People's History of the United States. The evidence from the court records of colonial Virginia shows that in 1630 a white man named Hugh Davis was ordered to be soundly whipped for abusing himself by defiling his body and lying with a Negro. 10 years later, 6 servants and a Negro of Mr. Reynolds started to run away. While the whites received lesser sentences, Emmanuel the Negro to receive 30 stripes and to be burnt on the cheek with the letter R, and to work in shackle 1 year or more as his master shall see cause. Although slavery was not yet regularized or legalized in those first years, the list of servants show blacks listed separately. A law passed in 1639 decreed that all persons except Negroes were to get arms and ammunition, probably to fight Indians. When in 1640 3 servants tried to run away, 2 whites were punished with a lengthening of their service. But as the court put it, the third being a Negro named John Punch shall serve his master for his assigns for the time of his natural life. Also in 1640, we have the case of a Negro woman servant who begot a child by Robert Swett, a white man. The court ruled that the said Negro woman shall be whipped at the whipping post, and the said Swett shall tomorrow in the forenoon do public penance for his offense at James City Church. Through my research, one thing is clear. Early colonial life, even for free colonists, was nothing to brag about. In fact, life during this time could legitimately be described as barbaric for those lacking wealth. Everything in the experience of the first white settlers acted as a pressure for the enslavement of blacks. The Virginians of 1619 were desperate for labor to grow enough food to stay alive. Among them were survivors from the winter of 1609 through 1610, the starving time. When crazed for want of food, they roamed the woods for nuts and berries, dug up graves to eat the corpses, and died in batches until 500 colonists were reduced to 60. In the journals of the House of Burgess of Virginia is a document of 1619 which tells of the first 12 years of the Jamestown colony. The first settlement had 100 persons who had 1 small ladle of barley per meal. When more people arrived, there was even less food. Many of the people lived in cave-like holes dug into the ground, and in the winter of 1609 through 1610, they were driven through insufferable hunger to eat those things which nature most abhorred, the flesh and excrements of man, as well as our own nation, as of an Indian. Digged by some out of his grave after he had lain buried 3 days, and wholly devoured him. Others, envying the better state of body of any whom hunger has not yet so much wasted as their own, lay wait and threatened to kill and eat them. One among them slew his wife as she slept in his bosom, cut her in pieces, salted her, and fed upon her until he had clean devoured all parts, saving her head. A petition by 30 colonists to the House of Burgess, complaining against the 12-year governorship of Sir Thomas Smith, said, "In those 12 years of Sir Thomas Smith, his government, we aver that the colony for the most part remained in great want and misery under most severe and cruel laws. The allowance in those times for man was only 8 ounces of meal and a half pint of peas for a day, mouldy, rotten, full of cobwebs and maggots, loathsome to man and not fit for beasts, which forced many to flee for relief to the savage enemy, who being taken again were put to sundry deaths by hanging, shooting, and breaking upon the wheel, of whom one, for stealing 2 or 3 pints of oatmeal, had a bodkin thrust through his tongue, and was tied with a chain to a tree until he starved." Now I'd like to jump to the subject of Bacon's Rebellion. Many people believe all participants in Bacon's Rebellion were freedom fighters, but this is not the case. In fact, for example, Bacon himself was a wealthy man who came from a wealthy family. Though he was known as an abolitionist, his main motive, at least at this time, had more to do with his desire to commandeer native lands by any means necessary, and he had issues with laws set forth by the Crown which prevented him and others from doing so. But, for the purposes of this video, I won't spend too much time discussing the rebellion blow by blow. The most important fact about Bacon's Rebellion is, most of the participants were white indentured servants and black-owned slaves who often worked, lived, and ate side by side. They were also punished side by side for many infractions in which they collaborated on, though the whites were often punished less severely. The most important thing about Bacon's Rebellion is what happened after the rebellion was put down, and after all of the participants were in custody or sent home in some cases. The Royal Commission set up to investigate the rebellion ladled out bromides about the credulous, silly people whom Bacon had misled. 2/3 of the colony were vulgar and most ignorant people who had been seduced, said the commission. One of the Tidewater elite, Richard Lee, was more honest and acknowledged that the rebellion was about inequality. Hopes of leveling, he said, lay behind the zealous inclination, the multitude, to support Nathan Bacon. Lee and his fellow grandees were left to worry about the implications of the revolt. From Maryland, where an attempted uprising was suppressed, the governor warned that unless a method of rule was adopted that would agree with the common people, the commons of Virginia would mire themselves as deep in rebellion as ever. A nightmare vision was conjured up of armed blacks and whites rising in unity against the planters. The support Bacon inspired brought home the elite their basic vulnerability. They had no sizable yeoman class as a barrier to servile revolt. European colonies and parts of the Caribbean had created a yeoman class by encouraging planters to parent children with slave or servant women. The Chesapeake colonies had not done this. In fact, they had positively discouraged interracial coupling. The task facing Virginia rulers now was to fashion a class that gave them as many Virginians with a stake in suppressing servile insurrection as there were in fomenting it. They played the race card. The status of the European servile class was upgraded and a sense of racial superiority instilled. Meanwhile, the process of degrading non-whites was accelerated. Law after law deprived Africans and Native Americans of rights, while bolstering the legal position of European servants. In the space of 20 years, non-whites lost their traditional rights, property rights, electoral rights, and family rights. They even lost the right to be freed if their master wanted to free them. In parallel, whites gained rights and privileges. masters were forbidden from whipping their white servants naked without an order from a justice. They were told to provide real freedom dues: corn, money, a gun, clothing, and 50 acres of land. And the notion of a white race was promoted. Hitherto, the English had never applied color to distinguish race. Now white servants, whose daily condition was little different from that of Africans, were taught they belonged to a superior people. On the big plantations, white and black began to be given different clothing. Living quarters were segregated. Sometimes the races ate separately. But whites remained chattels, and when they ran away, they were pursued as ferociously as ever. White slavery went on. Not only that, as the 18th century advanced, a vast new pool of potential white slaves materialized. The people of Central Europe began to share the American dream. But they wouldn't prove easy to handle. That last sentence is very true. Once whites received their social caste promotion, they certainly would later prove just how much they expected the upper class to keep their end of the bargain. It would be a deal they would never allow the elites to forget. From that point on, they expected to see a staunch difference in the way they were treated compared to those they now viewed as inferior to themselves. Though there were times when yeoman-class whites would experience political victories by checking the upper class, the oligarchs would always discover new ways to bring them back under their thumb, usually by playing on their feelings of racism and the fear of being replaced by another group of people, such as blacks or immigrants. The last time the white yeoman class experienced a victory over the American oligarch class was during the years and events which led to the New Deal. Using men like Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, they were able to beat back the Andrew Mellon class. But even the fruits of the New Deal, implemented by Democrats, was never intended to be shared with blacks. Wilson had illustrated strong anti-corruption progressive instincts, as well as the toxic racism of the Jim Crow era. He had fought a high-profile battle against the exclusive fraternity-style eating clubs that dominated the campus, and transformed Princeton from a provincial college for the wealthy into a world-class university, while still ensuring it would remain an all-white institution. Then as governor, Wilson proved that he was no puppet for big money. He got his start through the political machine, but once in office, Wilson enthralled progressives. He pushed election reform, the direct election of New Jersey senators, a public utilities commission that could effectively prevent monopolists from getting around pricing rules. Yet Wilson, like Roosevelt, did not intend the American promise to extend to African Americans. I'll be honest, there is so much more I want to say on this subject, but this video is already stretching out to a long one, so let's go ahead and wrap it up with some final but very important points. Now, after the attempted coup at the Capitol, the question is being posed: should the left work with the extreme right to take down America's oligarchs in the chokehold they have on the system? The logical answer is, of course, in theory, but in practice, not so much. These people are not warriors of liberty, democracy, and justice for all. These people are simply modern-day versions of their indentured servant ancestors, simply seeking to be acknowledged by a government that would treat them better than those they deem as other. They have no interest in creating a system where everyone is treated equally. They have no interest in coexisting on a level playing field. When they see non-white people being blatantly murdered by the state, they see the exact same thing we see. They just like what they see because they think that is as it should be. However, that same type of state violence should never be turned against them, even if they are raging through the Capitol, threatening to hang public officials while carrying guns and zip ties to secure hostages. In their eyes, they're still keeping up their end of the bargain their ancestors made, by being good yeoman-class citizens and keeping Negroes in check by doing such things as screaming Blue Lives Matter as a way of countering Black Lives Matter, and calling 911 if they witness a black person so much as sneeze too loudly. I wish I could honestly say differently, but these people want nothing to do with a system that works for everyone. As black people, we still have our hands full dealing with whites who aren't so proud to wear their racism on their shoulders. Whites who claim to be on our side, but when tested, even many of them move quickly to protect their white privilege. These are the ones who claim to be liberal, but love voting for politicians who use their legislative powers to cut taxes for the rich, even when they have the majority in both the House and the Senate, and engage in mass global violence to strengthen American imperialism while killing countless innocent men, women, and children around the world. These are people who proudly brag that their so-called political side is the lesser of two evils. Due to high levels of condescension, they fail to realize what a privileged and highly subjective point of view that truly is. I agree, the system is highly corrupt and has a ton of bipartisan problems due to the immense levels of corruption and rampant bribery in Washington, D.C. And I also agree that these problems should concern all American citizens. Both political parties take bribes from pharmaceutical companies, which enable them to charge Americans exorbitant amounts of money for life-saving medications, though those same medicines are cheap to produce. Then they sell those exact same drugs much cheaper to other countries whose governments negotiate drug prices for their citizens. These governments manage to negotiate low prices even after the cost of importing them. Our corrupt government passed laws that allow doctors to take bribes to become drug dealers for big drug companies instead of healers. As a result, countless whites in America experience mass drug addiction to painkillers. Even with one party claiming to be the party of science, both parties are guilty of taking large amounts of money from industries who want absolutely nothing to do with addressing global warming, even though countless credible scientists have made it clear the Earth and the people living on it are running out of time, and the poorest in humanity will be the first to suffer. Let's be honest, the Democrats, and certainly not the Republicans, will ever break ties with the oligarch class. It's just not realistic to think after all these years of taking money from the rich that they would ever one day decide to walk away from it. The corruption is so bad, even the politicians who don't take money from the oligarchs still somehow end up voting with the politicians who do. Not surprising, considering the hostility faced by any lawmaker trying to at least do a few things right. But through all of this corruption, there is still, believe it or not, a possible ray of hope. A sign that there are still Americans who are sick and tired of playing biased politics at the cost of America's downtrodden and the rest of the world. While we continue voting for candidates because it makes us personally feel good, the rest of the world pays the price. If you're someone who's sick and tired of the people who have basically kidnapped our government to serve their own interest, if you're sick and tired of people who have a strange undying loyalty to the political puppets in Washington and refuse to hold their feet to the fire, all I humbly ask is that you at least check out the People's Party. Why continue putting all of your efforts into trying to change a party that's so addicted to donor cash? Both the Republican and Democrat parties are private organizations and are completely within their rights to subscribe to whatever political ideology they wish to. It is not illegal for them to represent the rich if that is what they choose to do. Why continue trying to force them to fight for the people, only to have them do unscrupulous things to avoid doing so? Clearly, I do not believe blacks should work with racists to make change. But I am fairly certain of three things. 1. America has an extreme racism problem. 2. Centrism will never defeat that extreme racism. And 3. We'll never be able to make real change alone. We will certainly need alliances, but alliances with people who genuinely want positive change. I just can't go on pretending that people who do evil things are somehow immune to criticism because of their party affiliation. I cannot support a centrist party who literally insists on negotiating with a far-right extremist political party that has been pandering to domestic terrorist groups for generations. But if lesser evil is a bar that you can be proud of, then by all means, please have at it. But understand, many Americans aren't satisfied with supporting a political party simply because they're less evil than a party who is pure evil, which is the Republican Party. We are ready to move on to vote for something that cannot be categorized as evil, period. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, subscribe, and share. And most of all, stay safe.